So this topic is kind of a continuation of the habitat assessment topic. I've named it ecology, but there's obviously a whole lot more ecology to consider that's really kind of under the surface for what we're going to be looking at here. So ecology is the study of organisms living together and interacting. And so when we look at a community, we're looking at maybe the plants only. That's the plant ecology community. Those would be all the plants that live together, maybe compete with each other, maybe help each other out. Sometimes there's nutrient sharing. We talked in the habitat lecture about how dominant species, for example, the trees in this habitat can have an influence over how the other plants grow around them. And so it's kind of a complicated web, and most of this is outside the scope of the course that I'm teaching here. But getting to know what species grow together, that's kind of a good skill to have. So somebody who's well versed in plant ecology will go to a habitat like this and they'll be able to identify some of these plants by knowing how they look. And then other plants, they could identify them in part because they know what kind of habitat to expect them in. So growing in certain light levels, soil types, water conditions, growing with other associated plant species. These are all part of the toolkit of identifying plant species. So shown here, a variety of species all growing together in kind of a wet forested habitat. So as I mentioned, this relates back to the habitat assessment topic. This is one form of habitat assessment. This coefficient of conservatism has to do with how likely a habitat is to be pristine, kind of an example of that a little more on the left, versus a disturbed or modified habitat modified by humans, a little bit more shown on the right here. So these are kind of extremes of the two habitat types. On the right, the disturbed habitat is one that's actively being managed by people, and that active management being mowed, for example, this is a roadside on a highway, this is something they come through and mow these. That's going to be a human caused constraint on what kind of plants can grow there. Other factors in this human modified habitat are the proximity to the road. So that's going to affect the soil type a little bit. There'll be some gravel probably working its way into the habitat, as well as runoff, so salt runoff and oil runoff from the road. So it becomes a little bit of a harsher condition for plants to grow in, and that can be a difficult habitat for native plants to grow in, but we do have quite a few weeds that excel in this kind of habitat. So you'd be able to tell from the plants that this was in a modified habitat if you couldn't already figure it out from the, the road, the highway right there. But of course, this relates also to ecology, which is the current topic. And so finding these species that work well together, sort of building up from those dominant foundational species and building in the species that can grow with them. So dominant species in the forested habitat here on the left might be working with each other. There might be some dominant species that are enabling other species to grow there. And the same could be true for this roadside habitat on the right. So a little bit also relative to the question of modified disturbed habitats versus the pristine habitats, you can see that a little bit in the ranges of where species can grow relative to their coefficient of conservatism values. So I have some extremes on here. On the left are two species that have the maximum C value of 10, the alpine milk vetch and Schweinitz sedge. And these are very limited range species in Wisconsin, and sometimes limited range altogether. Just one county for the alpine milk vetch and a handful, or just one Wisconsin county for the Schweinitz sedge. And so these are where those plants grow. It's not only that they're rare, but they're probably depending on a particular kind of habitat. So that could be abiotic conditions, the soil type, light level, soil moisture, or they could be dependent on other plants that grow near there. And so changing their habitat would probably wiped them out. And so they become species of concern or endangered species within the state because they have very particular habitat needs. And so if we want to maintain all of the species that are currently in Wisconsin, the native species, then it takes an effort to keep track of some of the habitats that are more likely to get wiped out. On the right-hand side here, these are native species, but native species you're a little more likely to find kind of everywhere. So very common native species, and you can see that in their low C values. Perfectly good species, just ones that you're not as likely to find, or I should say more likely to find these species in human modified habitats. So blackberry, you can probably think of some habitats that have brambles, blackberries, and raspberries. Those are pretty good colonizing species, and they're good competitors. And they could live in places that are pristine as well as places that have been modified by people. Same thing here with the Solomon seal. So when you get these coefficient of conservatism values, you can think more about the kinds of habitats these species are able to grow in, like the wider range of habitat that they can tolerate. And that gets into this couple of terms that I've got in the header here, whether these species are habitat generalists or specialists. So generalist would be a species that can grow in a variety of habitats versus a specialist would be a species that depends on a very specific narrow range of habitat characteristics. So looking at the question of native and non-native species, modified versus pristine habitats, species that are generalists or specialists, sometimes you come away with the impression that some of the better colonizers in these human modified habitats are invasive species. Certainly that's the concern with a lot of our invasive species, is that they're going to move in large numbers as some of the first species that move into an area. So I've seen plenty of cases where say somebody takes a farm field and tries to return it to a native prairie situation. It can be a difficult effort to put the native plants in there and get them established while these non-native plants are trying to move in as well. So a lot of our non-native species and ones drifting over into this category of invasive species, those are the ones that tend to show up a little bit more in modified habitats. So they're kind of a threat everywhere, but they're particularly a threat in places where disturbance has happened, and disturbance can open up a new habitat that doesn't have a lot of plants in it to begin with. So forests that have been logged or otherwise had trees removed, or as I said, maybe agricultural fields that are being returned to a natural state, are going to show up with a lot of these good colonizing species, and some of them are, a lot of them tend to be these non-native species. So just real quick, we'll get into definitions here. When I talk about a native species, really we need a cutoff point in time to declare that a species is native or non-native. There have been people in Wisconsin since before European colonization. The humans in North America arrived here thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago from human migration. And they probably brought some plants with them. But the thing with that is that we don't have records. We don't have a really good record of plants that people brought, or even what plants were growing in the area 40,000 years ago versus 10,000 years ago. It's very hard to have a complete record of that. You might have a few fossils or pollen cores or something, but like a comprehensive record of what plants were growing here, not really feasible. So basically they've come up with a cutoff that's a little easier to enforce, and that would be the cutoff of plants that were here at the time before European settlers. So settlers mostly of European descent came through this area. Before that time, there's a decent record of species that were in Wisconsin at that time. So some of the first things that were done as North America was coming into possession of people from Europe was they sent people out to do habitat surveys. So they have some records of species that are found in North America, and voucher specimens and so on, just like we've talked about. And other species we can either make a note of when they first showed up in North America, because that's where their first specimens are from. Or we could kind of infer sometimes. So even if there's not a record of the first introduction of something, we could infer that it showed up because of humans by the fact that these species sometimes grow near where people are, or they showed up on common shipping routes or something. So that was kind of a long version of native species have been here since before European settlement. Non-native species would have shown up afterwards. And for the most part, we think of species being native to North America more broadly, but there's also a concern about species that are native to Wisconsin. And then within the non-native species, there are a couple of categories that are useful to divide these species up. One is naturalized. And a good example of a naturalized species is a plant called chicory. This is very common along roadsides in the mid to late summer. It does very well at getting itself around. It's really abundant in the state, but it's kind of limited to that human modified environment right next to the road. And so it's not really putting a lot of pressure on native, pristine, natural environments. It's kind of doing its own thing, growing on its own, as the definition there implies, but not really having a negative impact. So naturalized plants are able to grow away from where people are taking care of them, just kind of as a contrast to, say, a garden plant. So your garden tulips are not native either, but tulips are not a plant that really gets out into anywhere that people aren't putting it intentionally. So tulips, garden iris, a lot of those are, your cultivated garden plants typically don't escape out into nature. And then getting on the far spectrum of non-native plants that are now troublesome to natural communities, we get into this area where we're talking about invasive plants. So some people throw around the word invasive without necessarily following the scientific definition, but there's a basically agreed upon scientific definition for invasive, which is that they have to have a negative impact on the natural community, and also they need to be non-native. So you can have an aggressive native plant that is not actually invasive. It cannot be invasive if it's a native plant. And this is kind of born out of the fact that native plants have had a long time to work together. They've had a long time to get themselves into as many habitats as that species can. So if they're an aggressive native plant, they're sort of continuing to do what they've always done. But if they're an aggressive non-native plant, that's something that risks upsetting the natural balance of plant species. And just an illustration of what you sometimes encounter with invasive species. This is garlic mustard, one of our worst invasive species. It's just a herbaceous plant in the mustard family, and this is the result of a few plants maybe getting started, but this is a very prolific plant. It's one that is not really eaten a lot by native herbivores, produces a lot of seeds, competes against other herbaceous plants in the vicinity. So it takes over, and it actually is able to outcompete and sometimes outright just kill native plants that are growing nearby. And then it takes over like this and ends up being, invasive species. If you're a person who's interested in native botany, you end up having quite a dislike for invasive species because of the effects that they have. So invasive species, the study of invasive species is certainly an ongoing one, and I'd say there's no single answer to any question about invasive species. There's a wide open debate and lots of scientific inquiry about what makes a particular species a good invader. And sometimes we find evidence one way or the other, but it's hard to say just because we put them all in this invasive species category that they should share all these features in common. So some of these cases I'm going to mention are true for some species, but maybe not all true for all species. So first thing to consider here, plant species can be invasive because they're really good or maybe better than native species at growing and reproducing. So they get bigger, faster, maybe to outcompete their neighbors for light. And then we often see a whole lot of fruit or seed production in these species. So showing some species here with lots and lots of fleshy fruits in 3 of these examples, and then the garlic mustard produces a dehiscent, dry dehiscent fruit, and just lots of seeds all together. Whether this is more than native species, up for debate. Also, as a non-native species, these might be species that don't have a native animal that's destroying their seeds. So they might be kind of escaping a form that would decrease the number of seeds that they can reproduce with. If there's nobody eating their berries or destroying the seeds, that can cause them to reproduce relatively more than native species. Another big topic for invasive species is a hypothesis called release from natural enemies, or escaping your natural enemies. Basically, these plants are moved to North America from their native habitats, most often in Eurasia. Those are most of our non-native and invasive plants come from. If you bring a plant over, it's coming from a place where there might be a lot of animals that are adapted to chew on it, to destroy the seeds, and so on. And if you take just the plant without taking its natural enemies, this can free it up to do a lot better growing than it would otherwise. So there are not necessarily native herbivores and enemies that would attack the plant, and it's missing its own enemies that might attack it. Can give it a competitive advantage. So it's probable that native organisms will catch up at some point and maybe try eating these a little bit more, but there's a lot of animal behavior tied in with that. And so something like this purple loosestrife might not be attractive to any animals in the first stages of its invasion. So kind of a research pursuit to try and get around that. And it's a little bit, it's certainly one that draws a lot of attention. This idea that you could then import the enemies of a plant to do the feeding for you. And there have been plenty of cases where this did not work out well. So you might already be thinking, what happens if the enemies we bring in don't like this plant, but instead start chewing on native plants? That's the big concern. We have some cases where that has happened. And we're trying to be a little more informed about that, being a little more careful. And so typically the process of bringing in a natural enemy, this what we call so-called biocontrol, that process goes through a lot of vetting where they would probably take the native species and just test them out and make sure that the animals they're bringing in to eat the non-native species do not then show any desire to eat the native species. That's the goal anyway. Time marches on, and we'll see what happens a generation from now with these various examples. So this is the loosestrife beetle, Gelleracella. This is a common biocontrol for purple loosestrife. The advantage here is that a lot of our native plants, or sorry, invasive plants, are hard to control. You can't just necessarily get out there and destroy all the non-native plants in the world. But if you have an insect like this that's adapted to go attack them, the insect can find the plant, chew it up, reproduce itself, find more individuals. And so it becomes a more consistent, more natural solution than having a person go out with herbicide or dig these plants up or something. There's also a possibility that some of our invasive plants are actually harmful to their neighbors. So there's just straight up competition where it could be a plant that shades out its neighbors, or in some cases, there's evidence where these non-native plants, the invasive plants, can actually basically poison their neighbors through a process called allelopathy. So allelopathy is based on some Greek words, basically means the suffering of your neighbors. So causing distress to other plants in the vicinity. There are plants that release chemicals into the soil that can kill or inhibit other plants growing in their vicinity. And sometimes this is put forward as one of the major reasons for invasiveness in a species. So this plant called Japanese knotweed has been suspected of allelopathy. The garlic mustard, as I showed you before, has some ability to kill its competitors. And so this could be, again, one of these reasons for invasiveness is sort of a new chemical weapon that's not been seen by the native plants before, and they have no defense against it. It can be difficult for them to overcome. So another perspective on invasion and invasiveness is that invasive plants are taking advantage of human habitat alteration. So we can't pretend that nature outside of our doors is just the same as it always has been. There have been some human changes to the environment, some that we've done intentionally, so changes to agriculture or putting in roads, as I mentioned, uh, starting fires, cutting down trees. These are all changes to the natural habitat that could potentially shift the scales in favor of invasive species. This is one that's a big concern, the one that's shown on the slide here. This concept of increasing the nutrient levels in the environment. And this is something that's often seen in aquatic habitats. So showing a couple of examples of lakes, and they have a difference in their nutrient content. So on the left is called oligotrophic, that just means few nutrients. And then the other one is eutrophic, basically nutrient rich. And it's possible for natural wetland communities to be richer or poorer in nutrients just naturally before European settlement. The increase in nutrients, though, that we're largely concerned about is relative to agriculture. So we have artificial fertilizers as a major influence on the landscape these days, and runoff from those can end up in waterways. So if fertilization happens, fertilizing soils, whether that's somebody's lawn or an agricultural field, if that fertilizer, enough of that gets out into the flowing water that flows downstream, can end up really increasing the nutrient content of a lake. And again, that kind of tips the scales. So if you had a natural oligotrophic lake, there would be plants that are adapted to grow in that environment to survive and thrive in low nutrient conditions. But if you shift that from low nutrient to high nutrient, then those plants lose their competitive advantage, and they can get outcompeted by some more aggressive plants that take advantage of high nutrients. And again, this is a habitat, the eutrophic habitat is one that typically favors the invasive species. So a lot of our underwater invaders do well in high nutrient environments. And if that's a switch to a high nutrient environment that's artificial as a result of human activity, then that can really mess up the natural plant communities. So I've kind of alluded to a few other types of habitat alterations, so I'll mention them here. So cutting down trees is a big one. If you take a forest and turn it into an open area, that invites in plant colonization, and that could be non-native plant colonization. Changes to the fire schedules. These days, people use artificial fires on their prairies quite a bit more. I think as an intention to get back to more of a natural pattern. So before European settlement, it was a lot more common for fires to happen on the landscape, whether through natural conditions or set by native people who were living in North America. That was a common practice. And for a long time after European settlement, there was not a lot of fire going through these habitats. And that changed the competitive landscape a little bit. So fires, agriculture, logging, roads, all these things I've mentioned kind of all fall under this habitat alteration category. And it's just as an ecology question, we're looking at shifting the conditions that favor one group of plants versus another. So what do invasive species do? Well, you might have heard about them in the context of kind of getting in the way of human activities. So invasive species really draw our attention because they end up being abundant and good colonizers. And in a habitat like this, if we've got a high nutrient lake, then the non-native plants can move in and start growing densely. And if this was a case where the lake didn't have a lot of these plants before, and now it's got a bunch of plants because of the nutrient additions, This is a problem for people who might have been used to boating, fishing, swimming in this lake. People, for a lot of activities that we do on lakes, too many weeds can be perceived as a problem. So they mess up the boat motors, you make it difficult to go swimming, and so on. So a lot of people are, I think most people, when they think about invasive species, they might be thinking about impacts on human activities. Another impact is potentially as a result of this competition that a non-native species can kind of sort of come in and replace a native species. So we have lots of ecological categories of our native species. We've got shrubs and trees and vines, plants that grow in sandy soils and wet soils and so on. And if there's a plant that is non-native and a better competitor than a native species, then in every habitat where the native species might usually grow, these non-native species, the invasive species, could be driving them out as a result of competition and all those other factors we talked about, maybe making it sort of an extra reason why the native species are having a hard time surviving in that habitat. So just a little, not too much to this one today. Just a little overview of ecology, mostly with a lean towards the concept of invasive species.